All right, the room looks pretty clear, so we can jump in. Thank you all for being here. I'm Philissa Cramer, I'm the editor of JTA, and we are, I wouldn't say we're looking forward to talking to you all about anti-Semitism and the coverage we've been doing about it in the last few weeks, but we are grateful for your attention and are looking forward to kind of sharing what we've learned and answering your questions. Many of you were here a few weeks ago for a similar conversation that we had about the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and we had a very high response to that. A lot of people came, there were a lot of great questions. That was nothing compared to what happened when we sent out an invitation to come to this conversation. The interest in this topic is high, the anxiety is high, and we're seeing that every day in the stories that we're covering and the conversations we're having with readers like you. So I'm going to introduce everybody, and I have some questions. I want to emphasize that you can send me questions through the chat to Philissa Cramer, and I'll make sure that those questions get surfaced through the conversation. If you send them to the wrong place, don't worry, they'll come to me eventually, and we do really welcome your questions. So as soon as the rockets started flying several weeks ago, we jumped into the conversation that newsrooms always jump into about what is our role here and how much are we covering, American Jewish reaction, and how much are we trying to explain for our readers, what's happening on the ground in Israel. And that was a really robust conversation. And Cnaan, our reporter based in Europe, said, well, I know exactly what I need to do. I need to write a story about how European Jews are bracing for a spate of anti-Semitic incidents in Europe, because that's what happens. And that was a level of clarity that, was based on years and years of reporting, and has really shaped our experience as journalists covering the conflict and what has persisted after. So, a ceasefire is declared, but the story, the story that began during this conflict is unfolding right now, and it seems very clear that for American Jews and for European Jews, this moment is going to last for quite a while, and is being felt with a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear, and a lot of conversation about, do we live in a society where anti-Semitism is taken seriously, and who is on our side? And that is a conversation that is extremely robust and something we'll talk about here today. So I will point you to the folks in the room, and I have a few questions, and we can jump in. So we have with us Ben Sales. He is both our anti-Semitism reporter and our lead on coordinating Israel coverage. So basically, Ben has been doing nothing for a couple weeks, and is really glad we're having this event so that he has some work to do. Ben, we incredibly appreciate your hard work, and I know all of our readers have benefited from your tireless efforts covering both the conflict in Israel and the spate and anti-Semitic event incidents that have unfolded in the U.S. We also have Cnaan Lipshiz, who's based in Amsterdam and has been covering European Jewry for years for us. And we have Ron Kampeas, our DC reporter, who has been covering, and we'll talk about the unfolding conversation on Capitol Hill about where criticism of Israel has kind of emerged in new and taken new forms, that even some lawmakers are kind of challenging each other and calling anti-Semitic. So everyone here has been part of our coverage. I want to shout out the rest of our team also, who we didn't bring everybody to this conversation, but this really has been an all hands on deck moment. And I think we're all, we're glad to be able to tell the stories that need to be told during this time. So I want to go back to you, Cnaan, and just go back to that moment where you told us, this is the story that I need to do, and tell us, what your experience has been covering covering anti-Semitism in Europe, what you expected now, and how, and what are you seeing this time around that's surprising you or different from what you've seen in the past?
Right. So thanks a lot, everyone, for gathering for this unpleasant talk. I've had the sad benefit of experience, as Philissa mentioned, and part of it is because I feel that in some respects, Europe is, the past few years has shown that Europe is ahead of the curve when it comes to these matters of the US. So what you're beginning to see in the US now, we in Europe have been experiencing for some of it at least for years. And so when the rockets started flying, I drew back on some pretty traumatic experiences from 2004, the summer of, 2014, when the previous major attack, exchange of fire between the IDF and Hamas in Gaza triggered some horrific scenes in Europe. I think the worst of them was when about 100 mostly Arab men gathered outside the Synagogue de la Roquette in Paris and tried to storm in when there were 150 worshippers inside, and the only thing standing between that rabble and the worshippers were men from the Jewish community, and those iconic cafe coffee tables started flying across the plaza opposite the synagogue in some surrealist scene of violence. And that was just the culmination of the wave of violence that we saw then. There were thousands of incidents, there were injuries, there were torchings of 10 synagogues. And so it was clear as soon as it started solidifying into something serious that we would see a repeat of that in some way. Yet, though we were prepared for that here, there were some characteristics about the current wave that are surprising because they're new. They're new even to veteran observers of what's called in Europe the import of the Israeli-Arab, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have a name for it. And that was, I think, first of all, the kind of shameless or unmasked conflation or attribution of the exchange between Israeli, Zionist, and Jew. For example, one of the most traumatic events was a convoy of about 10 cars driving across the UK on May 16, when with Palestinian flags, they drove from Bradford in the north into the heart of Jewish London, Golders Green, with the people in the cars shouting obscenities like, F word the Jew, rape their daughters. That's something that has not been seen, this level of malevolence and open anti-Semitism on the streets of London. It really shook people's confidence in their future there. There was another less famous incident, perhaps, and I'd like to actually read to you a short post on Facebook from a person that I won't reveal his name because it's a private post and he's a government employee, but the content is what matters. There have been more shocking anti-Semitic incidents this week. The convoy, a rabbi brutally beaten outside his synagogue in Essex, numerous Jewish teachers and pupils yelled at and given Nazi salutes, shoppers harassed by an angry mob inside Arndale Centre in Manchester, mezuzahs torn off from people's doorstops, and he goes on like that. But this video of a mob of Muslims breaking into the home of a blogger, a Palestinian blogger called Abu Light in Birmingham. That's what shocked him the most. They broke in because he was saying some moderate stuff about Israel. That's on Muslim violence already. And the reason this was shocking, and I think I'll end there, is that this time the mobilization was very rapid. That convoy of 10 cars with the paraphernalia and equipment, it happened within 2 days of the conflict. That break-in happened within 1 day. So that tells you, if you know how these things work, that tells you that there is a dormant network, probably communicating over social media, ready for action whenever something happens. And that's new because the scene I described from France, well, that was more spontaneous. These were uh, rabbles, those were crowds that broke off from anti-Israel protests, and then one thing led to another, and they picked the nearest synagogue. It's much easier to prepare for that. But when you have infrastructure in place with coordinators and people who just give the word and it's off, then you're talking about a new reality. And I think that's part of what's far more frightening for Jews in Europe right now. And I think that's also part of the reason that we're seeing for the first time leaders of communities saying that the fight on anti-Semitism may have been lost. You saw it in the chief Dutch rabbi, Benjamin Jacobs, who said that if it weren't for his position, he'd leave for Israel or the United States. You saw it in the words of Brigitte Wilson, secretary in the Inter-Rabbinate Council here in the Netherlands, who said that the canary in the coal mine is dead. She was meaning, if she meant if Jews were the canary in the coal mine, then that bird is dead. And you saw it in a much more open expressions of doubt that has been going on in the background, on the back burner for quite a while.
Anyone who has not read Cnaan's reports, they're very, very moving, collecting these sentiments. And Ben, I'd love to hear from you. Some of what we've seen in the U.S. seems to fit into the patterns that Cnaan has documented in Europe. Some of it is different. And one big difference, of course, is that there isn't kind of an organized Jewish community to issue those kinds of statements or comments. Organized meaning, like capital letters, community, to issue those kinds of statements of confidence or lack of confidence. But among the kind of in the conversation that's unfolding and that you're documenting, I think that kind of conversation is happening widely. So I'd love to hear, Ben, about what you're seeing in the U.S. And what has surprised you.
Sure, and I think it's exactly like you said, that in 2014 I was in Israel when that Gaza war was taking place, and it's kind of looking from afar at what Cnaan was reporting and what was happening in Europe back then. And this year, like you said, I feel like it feels like it's beginning to happen over here. And every time I tell that to Cnaan, he says, "What are you talking about? If you think this is what it is, you haven't seen anything. It's much worse over in Europe than it is in America." But yeah, I mean, just to recap, probably what a lot of people have read in the news, and the reason why a lot of people are here on this chat today is because we saw actually in the final days, really, of the conflict in Israel, we saw this kind of spate of street assaults in New York, LA, elsewhere, and vandalism of synagogues in the United States, some of which had explicit anti-Israel or anti-Zionist rhetoric. Some of it was straight up classical anti-Semitism without even any reference to Israel. And people were very scared, just to be frank. And there was talk that I and my colleague Shira Hanau reported on about people being afraid to wear Jewish symbols, or conversely, defiantly wearing Jewish symbols in the face of this string of attacks. And Jewish communal organizations that monitor these things, like the Anti-Defamation League and other organizations, did document the spike in incidents. I want to be clear, and maybe I'm jumping the gun on this, but I just want to be clear about those statistics include anything from the assaults that I think justifiably got pretty wide coverage, to signs that compare Israel to Nazi Germany at rallies, and kind of everything in between: vandalism, street harassment. So it's a whole range of incidents that are collected in those tallies, and altogether it shows a rise in in anti-Semitic incidents over the past couple of weeks, including a rise in physical assault. It's not as if, these things were happening week to week. And it's really been a scary time. And I think that, for American Jews, just, reading and hearing about this, there's obviously been past conflict in Israel in 2014 and in past years. And at least in recent memory, in the past couple decades, since, the series of conflicts in Gaza began, over a decade ago, there hasn't ever been a reaction like this in the United States on the street. And, it's also been coupled with anti-Semitism online, anti-Semitic abuse online. And that's a bit thornier of an issue to wade into. And I think we're going to talk about it later. But, there's a lot on Instagram and other social networks, TikTok, and to a certain extent, Twitter as well. There's been a lot of, first of all, pro-Palestinian advocacy, but a lot that has verged onto what a lot of Jews on these platforms feel is abuse and have taken to be abuse. I'm writing an article about that very issue right now. And one person I spoke to on Friday said, if somebody just posts Free Palestine on Instagram or on Twitter or whatever, is that anti-Semitic? Some people might say so, but not unequivocally, right? But let's say somebody, this person was like, I've heard of people who are posting challah recipes on Instagram or posting a TikTok video and receiving messages like Free Palestine or Israel's terrible or something like that. And that's where you see this thing where it, these are slogans that are associated with the pro-Palestinian movement, and then they kind of verge into what people feel is anti-Semitism. And that's kind of there's been this feeling that that's happening, and it's making people feel like the spaces where they were once comfortable are no longer comfortable spaces for them. And, I spoke to somebody at the ADL and they said, you can't make a one-to-one comparison between something that happens online and a street assault and a Jew getting beaten up in the street. But it's clear that there is an atmosphere and a discourse that does influence these things. And I think a lot of it is nebulous, and it's sometimes hard to pin down, A caused B caused C. But I do feel like there's an atmosphere right now in Jewish communities where even among people who have a range of opinions about the current Israeli government, whatever the current Israeli government looks like, and it might look different tomorrow, but regardless of your opinions on Israel's government or the conflict in Gaza or Israel's conduct in Gaza, a lot of people feel like there's kind of been this crossing over where they don't feel safe kind of expressing themselves Jewishly in any space. And that it feels like has been brought into a new era.
And I want to talk a lot more about what we're seeing on social media, because I think that for many people, that is where they're experiencing anti-Semitism right now. But could you just put this in context, Ben? Like, before this conflict, what were we seeing in terms of anti-Semitism in America, and kind of where did we feel like things were headed?
So there's certainly been a rise since 2013 or 2014, but especially kind of ramping up in 2015 and 2016. Year to year, both according to the FBI and according to the ADL and other measures, anti-Semitism has increased in the United States. And that's probably not a secret to many of the people here on this call. Certainly if you've read anything in JTA over the past few years, and that's obviously expressed itself in the attacks that we all know about in Pittsburgh, in Poway, California, in Jersey City, in Muncie in 2019. There was a whole stream of street harassment and assaults in Brooklyn also in 2019 and early 2020. And so, yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism has been increasing. And, I think that people that follow this kind of see what happened, see the conflict in Gaza and say, okay, this is one more trigger for people to let this out. And part of the way I view it, at least, is, and I feel bad saying this, but, the world is getting back to normal after a year of the pandemic, or a year plus of the pandemic. And part of that is the return of the anti-Semitic incidents that we saw in late 2019 before the pandemic started, right? So in New York, if you rewind to December 2019 or January 2020, there was a whole string of street harassment and assaults. And now we're seeing that again. And I think we've seen that in a few ways in American life. So certainly, sadly, in that sense, this is kind of a continuation of what we've seen. To me, the difference, there's really two differences, which is that it's never been connected to Israel this explicitly before. Like I said, in 2014, where the war lasted a lot longer and a lot more people died in 2014 than this year, we didn't see this kind of reaction in the United States. There was certainly passionate, raucous protest on both sides, right? I mean, pro-Palestinian protests and pro-Israel protests, and there were new groups that were formed and everything like that. But in terms of the amount of harassment and physical assault that we've seen, in addition to the online climate that I was talking about, that's new. We didn't see that in 2014, and certainly not in 2012 or in 2009. When the last two kind of major rounds of Gaza conflict happened before 2014. So that's one thing. And of course, just like social media is constantly evolving and kind of constantly becoming more of a focus of discourse among young people and even not so young people, just the amount of conversation and also accusations of abuse that we've seen are unprecedented there too. So that feels new, even if in some cases it's a continuation of this kind of years-long trend of a rise in anti-Semitism.
I want to spend a little bit more time talking about social media. I've done some reporting about the experience of people there who are maybe not definitely not setting out to make Israel politics or even their Jewish identities central to what they're doing on social, and yet it's thrust upon them. And that is something that I've spoken to many people who are responding very strongly and saying, I hadn't experienced anti-Semitism and now I have. And that has been shocking to me, hearing folks who are not, much of the time we're talking to people who are professionally invested in this world and this space, and these people are not, and really feeling very surprised by what is happening to them. I spoke to one woman who has a party supply company, and she puts pictures on her Instagram of, balloon installations that she makes, and she said, it doesn't feel good to my mental health. I'm seeing so many people criticize Israel, criticize Israelis. It's spilling over into what I feel is anti-Semitism, and I can't avoid it in the space where I am most comfortable. That felt really, really surprising to me. And so I think we could spend a little bit of time talking about that. I mean, Ben, you mentioned that social media is one thing that has changed. Another thing that has changed is this sense that I think we all have paid attention to over the last year, especially that it's not enough if you see an injustice. And if you see an injustice in the world, you've got to do something in the space that you're in, right? And I think that's kind of the atmosphere on social media, that it's unacceptable to be quiet. And so maybe a few years ago, where someone might think this thing that's happening in Israel doesn't sound great, is happening, Palestinian children are dying in rocket attacks, but I don't know that much, so I'm just not going to say anything. If there was ever a moment where that was true, it is not this moment. And I think that really does change the dynamic for many people, where there's kind of what I'm hearing described to me as like an oppressive atmosphere of there's nowhere to turn, and a feeling that without warning, it became clear to folks that people that were their followers, and they chatted about food, or they chatted about party supplies, or they chatted about parenting, suddenly there's this wedge that's related to this core aspect of their Jewish identity, and that's changed their experience in the world. I don't know what we call that, because I think in our reporting and in the discourse we talk about, right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism, and I don't know what we call that, but it's what I'm hearing people on the ground be very surprised by. Ben, I don't know if you or anybody here want to kind of add to that, and then I have a few questions I want to bring up.
I do want to say something. I think you're absolutely right that the racial justice protests last year really changed the way people talk about this. I really hate the phrase "both sides," and I keep using it because obviously this is a multifaceted conflict, both in Israel and in Israel and the Palestinian territories, and here in the United States. But I'm going to say the racial justice protests changed dialogue here on both sides. Because of the way that you just described, that people, pro-Palestinian advocates say, if you stood up for racial justice last year, you should stand up for us this year. And so you see people wading into it, like you said, in a way that they haven't in past years. And it's also happened, among pro-Israel activists and advocates, and also people that aren't necessarily in that space, but feel that they're experiencing anti-Semitism, where they say, we were allies, or we tried to be allies last year. We don't feel like we have allies now. Nobody's standing up for us. That's not, of course, that's not true across the board. And there have been many instances where people have, stood up against anti-Semitism. None of this is absolutely true. And part of what I want to hedge kind of everything I've said thus far, that, a lot of this, especially in something that's so ethereal as social media, a lot of it is about perception. And a lot of it is about filter bubbles that you see kind of what algorithms condition your feed to see on social media. So nothing is absolute. And of course, there are exceptions to literally everything that we've said. But I certainly have seen a sentiment that, people want to see support for this. I think, if you could say one thing across the board, it's that last year, the lesson that activists on every side of an issue took is that if I'm saying something, I deserve support from the bystanders. Like you said, there's no such, you can't just stay silent, that everyone kind of expects people to make a statement in one way or another. And that again feels new this year as opposed to several years ago.
And Ron, this has come up in DC, this idea of allyship and this idea of, this is a conversation and you've covered it, and maybe you can describe, and that's all, I think all new, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, all new to this space. So if you can describe kind of what you've been covering and what has surprised you in that conversation, that would be great.
Yeah, Jeremy Burton, the director of the JCRC, for a story I just wrote, he put it very well. He said, the real shift is that when this kind of issue, when there's been a war, the conversation has been until now about, hey, we're pro-Israel, but we have to bring the Palestinians into our equation of being American, of having a humanitarian American policy. We have to be pro-Palestinian as well. And for the first time on May 13th, there was a debate, and it was a debate among Democrats on the House floor. And he said, and you can see it in the speeches, that speeches from people who are associated with the squad, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Diana Presley and Cori Bush, they were pro-Palestinian, and there was no need to qualify that by saying, of course, Hamas shouldn't fire rockets on Israel. And we were talking about the differences between now and 2014. That's one of the big differences. The conversation in 2014 politically was about elevating the whole Palestinian issue. You had the establishment of, if not now, the Jewish group that advocates against the occupation. That was one of the big Jewish stories coming out of there. And now it's about to what degree do we even talk about anti-Semitism coming out of this? And so an adjacent event to that debate was the fact that so many of the same people, notable exception being Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but so many of the others like Bernie Sanders, like Jamal Bowman from New York, one of the new members of the squad, would put out statements condemning anti-Semitism in the case of Bowman because it was happening in his district, but also oddly qualify it by saying that there should not be Islamophobia as well. And of course, there's, nobody's going to argue that there should be Islamophobia, but traditionally, it had for some, I think, people like an all lives matter type of vibe that Black activists complained about in the past, where you seem to, one reflexively needs to say, oh, of course we care about Jews, but we care about these other people as well. And so why is that happening, and where is that coming from? And that's very different in the political sphere. And you had an extreme manifestation of it, not necessarily in Congress, but at Rutgers University the other day, where Rutgers put out a statement condemning anti-Semitism and a spike in anti-Semitism. And there have been incidents in New Jersey, so it made sense that they would put out that kind of statement. And they had in there what I guess has to be a de rigueur aside, but it wasn't the whole statement, it was just one aside about the war and the people who suffered in the war and the Palestinians and the Israelis who suffered in the war. And then it got back to anti-Semitism. And a Palestinian group on campus complained about that, saying, why are you, essentially saying we shouldn't even bringing up anti-Semitism now. And there was an activist, I think in Michigan, who was a Bernie Sanders surrogate in the 2020 election, who said, stop condemning anti-Semitism. We don't have to condemn anti-Semitism. He's a Palestinian American. And that sense that even mentioning anti-Semitism is somehow transgressive. The idea that, and the way it's rationalized is that this has been used in the past to instrumentalize anti-Palestinianism, with everybody switches into anti-Semitism. That's what the threat is, because of course, there, as we've talked about today, there are real incidents of anti-Semitism, and when you qualify your speech like that, I think you're giving your constituents a good reason to be worried that they're not your top priority at this moment.
One of the things I'm hearing from you and thinking about and seeing in some of the questions from people who have sent in questions right now is, I guess a question I have for all of you, where are Jews right now, Jewish organizations, Jewish people, in being able to define and call attention to anti-Semitism? It really feels like at this moment, not necessarily easy to be a leader in that conversation without having someone criticize, without having whatever incident you've identified or sentiment that you've identified as anti-Semitic be criticized. I'm not sure that that's always the case when folks are calling attention to injustices. It's certainly something that I'm attuned to as a Jew and a Jewish journalist, and I'm curious what you all are seeing and what questions you're asking about that.
I mean, just on the political sphere, what I should mention that there are people who are robustly speaking out against this, including Congress people. And so you have Dean Phillips in Minnesota, whose district neighbors Ilhan Omar, and he's Jewish. He's Dear Abby's grandson, as it happens, and he's kind of emerged as a very outspoken spokesman for the idea that just deal with the anti-Semitism, don't qualify it, don't bring in other issues, and to also there's also like a small, and this is a lot of Republicans, but also a number of Democrats who are saying, sort of trying to elevate this into talking about the boycott, the divestment and sanctions movement against Israel, or into calling Israel a terrorist state, or other means they're trying to make a broader issue about whether Israel should even exist. Those things are anti-Semitic. So they're bringing in that as well, and that's part of the conversation. So there are those voices that are speaking up.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, I think that because a lot of this is happening online, of course not all of it, but a lot of it is happening online, the people that have taken it upon themselves to kind of defend, to fight against what they see as anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism online, part of them say, where are the traditional Jewish organizations that are fighting this? We're more outspoken. Part of them say, you know, the establishment organizations are doing what they do and we do what we do, and we're not, you know, that's not our fight. And honestly, if you look at the discourse online, like just the language is more extreme all around, where like, you know, you have, I wrote about this last week, I think it was last week. I wrote about how accusations that Israel's committing genocide have like exploded online. And few, if any, international law experts or human rights lawyers say that Israel's conduct, even if they think it's abhorrent or not, you know, think that it almost nobody says it qualifies as genocide, regardless of what they think of it. But you know, that kind of language has exploded. Also, you know, ethnic cleansing or colonialism, kind of terms that have existed certainly for a long time, and Israel's been accused of, but they're far more common now. On the you know, pro-Israel activist side, or some people say the anti-Antisemitism activist side, you know, people have used phrases like a social media pogrom, or like have compared it, you know, to the run up to the Holocaust on social media or things like that. And there's been pushback against that too, that like, you know, it might be bad, but you know, it's not the Holocaust. So, you know, so I think we've kind of seen an escalating of language in a lot of places.
You mentioned, you know, the different responses and the different efforts that are unfolding to combat the anti-Semitism that folks are seeing and experiencing. We have a number of questions about this. A lot of people asking, what can we do? Where can we turn if we want to make this our issue? Who should we look to work with? And I'm curious to hear reactions, both the answers to that, both from you, Ben and Ron in the US. There's one question, Ron, that says, should we just keep writing to our lawmakers, or is there something else we're supposed to do? And then Cnaan, you know, if there are examples in Europe of effective strategies or places that have, you know, places that have seen some progress in this space, we'd love to hear about that as well.
Well, I mean, there's you know, there are 5 organizations, Jewish Federations of North America, ADL, the American Jewish Committee, Hadassah, and the Orthodox Union, that put out 6 points that they would like to see from the administration. So certainly if you want to engage with the administration on this issue, those 6 points might be a good place to start if you agree with any or all of them. And they include naming an ambassador to combat anti-Semitism. That person is mostly outward focused toward Europe, but certainly, as Cnaan has vividly described, there is a big problem in Europe. And the utility of that has shown to be that if somebody who has this backing of a particular administration is coming to your country and you're saying anti-Semitism is a problem, it's been shown that other governments who want, you know, nice relations with the United States sit up and pay attention. Also advocating for a Jewish liaison to the Jewish community, between the White House and the Jewish community, in order to streamline the communications that happen now. Advocating for increased funding for security for nonprofits, talking about anti-Semitism on campus, referring specifically to the Trump administration's executive order issued in 2019, and you know, asking Biden, and which he's done. He's actually they sent the letter on a Friday, and he already was on the case on a Monday, making his office a bully pulpit to talk about anti-Semitism, and he's kind of done that. So I mean, those are the you know, those are the agenda items that one could bring up if you're going to make a legislative call or a call to the you know, the executive branch of the White
House. I always, just to be frank, I feel a little uncomfortable as answering this question, because I don't see it as my role to point people toward you know, activism items or talking points, or certainly organizations, especially organizations that I report on and speak to as sources, just to be totally frank about it. Like, the way I have approached this when people ask me this over the past couple of weeks, and they've asked me over and over, so I've had to figure out some way to respond, is like, you know, if you feel like you're experiencing abuse, either online or in real life, you shouldn't be shy about that, and about naming it. Especially on social media, logging off is also an option. And if you feel like you're in a space that's unsafe or uncomfortable for yourself, you don't need to be there. You might feel like you want to be there and you don't want to give up the space, and that's fine, but you also don't need to. And in terms of doing, in terms of like helping others fight this, there's a whole range of organizations that in one way or another, based on their theory of best practice or ideology, fight anti-Semitism. And I want to be clear, again, I feel like a lot of what I've been doing is hedging, but I do want to be clear that no experience is universal, and that there are a lot of Jews kind of across the political spectrum on this, especially on social media, who have also been critical of Israel and been advocating kind of on the pro-Palestinian side. And so I don't want to make it seem like it's this kind of black and white battleground on social media. I think a lot of the issue there is that there's a lot of gray area. I think, at least for me personally, the more shocking stuff has been the stuff that's happened, as we say, in real life, physical attacks where you see somebody who was, visibly Jewish who was attacked on the street in New York. And yes, he was on his way to a pro-Israel rally, but that's not any kind of excuse. And just to see that is very shocking to me. And in terms of how to fight that, Jews have been getting out on the street about this and protesting, either with or without kind of the official backing of organizations. And so there's a whole range of things out there, but I'm not going to kind of favor one over the other.
Ron, is there anything you'd want to add from where you sit?
I don't know if.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, you.
I don't know if this fits the best practices category, because it's very specific to the European context. But France, which I mentioned earlier, which was an epicenter of anti-Semitic violence during the 2014 conflict, was conspicuously absent almost from the goings-on now. And part of it has to do with a robust plan to limit radical Islamism in France that Macron introduced a couple of months ago. Perhaps it has to do with it. Perhaps the organizations that would promote such protests that have been banned by the government, and I'll get to that in a second, perhaps they're thinking, let's pick our battles. We're fighting over keeping Islamic schools open. Let's not throw a tantrum over Israel right now. Maybe keep the people inside. And on the ground, France banned those anti-Israel protests as they were being planned. That happened also in 2014, but then there was very little enforcement. So the protests went on despite bans, citing public order. And when there were agitators trying to hold up the protests anyway, they're arrested. That's very, very unusual for France to arrest someone over a planned demonstration. That goes to the heart of the French Constitution and the freedom of expression. So this robust action in France may have been somehow responsible to reducing the amount of violence there right now, when authorities signal that they're not kidding around. In Austria, you saw, and in the Czech Republic, although they have a far smaller Muslim community that's likely to be agitated by this. But in Austria, where there is a large Muslim presence, the Chancellor Kurz flew the Israeli flag on the federal building, signaling also where he stands on this, and maybe reducing the motivation of local Muslim groups to pick a fight over this.
And Ron, were you gonna add anything there?
No.
I think you prefaced that, Cnaan, by saying that you weren't sure that this was the French example is a best practice, and I would say that that's as a strategy that isn't one that's necessarily in line with kind of the values of a democracy, and so that's a tension. I'm seeing a lot of questions about. We've talked a lot about Israel. I'm seeing a lot of questions about Israel. I'm seeing a question that obviously runs through the heart of all of this, which is all criticism of Israel anti-Semitic? Is that what we're talking about? And then I also see someone noting, we were dealing with anti-Semitism in the world before Israel existed, and that is an understatement to say the least. And Ben, one of the things that you said reminded me of a conversation I had with someone who's, if we're talking about responses, there's a group of Instagrammers who are doing a bake sale against anti-Semitism, and we have a story coming out about that. And one of the people I talked to who's part of that said, I can tolerate Israel criticism all day. I agree with it. Like, more, please, that's fine. But I'm afraid for my family members walking down the street. I know that people in my life who I love have changed their behaviors because they're fearful right now of being visibly Jewish in public where they live. And I can't stand for that, and I'm going to take a stand against it. So is there a way to disentangle, is there a reason to disentangle Israel from anti-Semitism? Is there a way to do it? Is that an exercise or that matches reality, or should we have that conversation even? Ben, I'm curious about your reaction there.
I'm not sure what disentangle means in that context. I'm going to say a few things that a lot of people have said before, which I think are kind of obvious, but I'll just say them. Israel is a country. Countries do a lot of things. Criticizing the policies of a country is a fine thing to do. On this note, there's a lot of the discourse around anti-Semitism in America, at least over the past year or two, has been around how to define anti-Semitism and to what extent which criticisms of Israel fall under the label anti-Semitism, right? So the most widely adopted definition, which is called the IHRA definition or the IRA definition, and to find out what that stands for, you can look it up. I'm not going to go into all that. Basically says that there's a range of criticisms of Israel that kind of fall under the category of anti-Semitism, calling Israel a racist endeavor, comparing it to the Nazis, saying it shouldn't exist as a Jewish state, things like that. And recently there have been coalitions of academics and scholars that have pushed back and kind of written definitions of anti-Semitism, their own definitions that that under their terms allow for a wider range of criticism of Israel and harsher criticism of Israel, and say, even harsh criticism of a country's policies or of what you want for a country's future isn't anti-Semitic. Like I did before, I'm going to obnoxiously not take a stand on those things. I will say, in terms of not wearing Jewish symbols around, there are definitely people in New York where I live who haven't done that, who have stopped doing that in recent days. I wear a kippah. I don't always wear it, but I wear it often. I've continued walking around with it. This is something that Cnaan can speak to more than me because he lives in Europe, but I spent some time in Europe about 14 years ago. God. And at that point, I was a college student, and I wore my kippah everywhere, and it was kind of, I thought of it as a statement back then. And I probably wouldn't make the same choice in Europe nowadays if it were just me personally, mostly based on what I read from Cnaan's reporting. New York has always felt different to me, and I think the questions that some Jews are asking right now is, are we trending in that direction? Is New York or America going to have that same atmosphere that people feel Europe has now? I'm here to report on that. I'm not here to answer that question. It doesn't, I think conditions in every country are different, but I think that that's kind of what is provoking a lot of the anxiety now. What's happening is bad, but I think people are also worried about what it might portend. And that's kind of what's driving a lot of the anxiety.
I want to share a comment that came in from somebody who's on the call who lives in the UK. And I think this comment really exemplifies the impossibility of drawing any line between, it's possible, but the complication around drawing lines between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism or anti-Israel criticism. This person writes, I live in the UK. I am following a conversion course. Some of those close to me have greeted my decision with dismay. I have been told that by considering Judaism, I am condoning Palestinian genocide. The question is, how have you responded to similar comments? And I don't think anybody here has gotten those. But I think that comment really, I think, summarizes a lot of what we've been covering and gets at the heart of it, and sounds like a very, very difficult and painful experience. And I'm sorry that you're having it. We'd love to learn more. But I guess I'm curious for the folks on our panel, if when you hear that comment, what directions does that take you as a journalist? What questions do you think, I want to investigate this next?
Certainly anything anecdotal, that comes up that shows that people are just being made to feel uncomfortable as Jews, quad Jews, like somebody converting to Judaism and getting those kinds of reaction. People are, this is something that we've been covering, that Ben has been covering, and Shira has been covering extensively. Visible Jews who are, physically assaulted or are made to feel alienated or unwanted in their environs. Anything like that is, we want to be on top of.
I see a number of folks with raised hands. I think we would really prefer you to type in those questions, and we're happy to ask them in the few minutes that we have left. I'm just scrolling through to make sure that these big topics here we've covered. And I'll just kind of read a few of the sentiments that have come through. Whatever we are doing now seems insufficient for the current situation. That's a question about, would it behoove Jewish communities to build stronger relationships with non-Jewish communities, non-Jewish leaders in their communities? There's also a question, well, can we, maybe could we get out of this, the anti-Semitism? Are there policies that could move Israel to make changes that would reduce anti-Semitic criticism, criticism of Israel that slides into anti-Semitism? And there are also a bunch of questions about kind of divides within Jewish communities, where I think that's what we're going to see next, is the real reckoning with some of the tensions that have been sketched out during this time, where there are real differences of opinion and different ways of talking about anti-Semitism and talking about criticism of Israel, different levels of concern and alarm. That's a narrative that we're going to continue to cover over time. But Ben, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just want to speak to the changes in Israeli policy. Like I said, the debate over Israel's policy is robust and can even be vitriolic, and it can still remain a debate over policy. And there's, of course, like I was saying before, there's a lot of gray area where there's swaths of criticism that some people call anti-Semitic and some people don't. And then there are things that are black and white, and things that I think basically everybody would call anti-Semitic. Like the fact that the phrase Hitler was right was tweeted 17,000 times over a certain span of the conflict. That's not about Israeli policy. Like, was Israeli policy the broader context for it? Sure. But like, as you can probably tell, I get kind of mealy-mouthed in terms of like advocating one thing or another. I can say pretty clearly that like, if you're going to say Hitler was right, that's not a comment. Like Israeli policy changes are not going to change that, right? So I just want to be clear that even though there's a lot of gray area on what some people consider criticism of Israel, some people consider anti-Semitism, and some people consider something in between, there is certain measures of certainty here.
I'll note that we have somebody here, hi, who's joining from Nashville, where a store made international news this weekend because they were selling, you know, yellow stars that were supposed to represent, you know, vaccine passports as a statement about vaccination. That does not have anything to do with Israel. It has a lot to do with kind of the dignity afforded to Jews and Jewish story. And that's part of what's swimming around right now too. So a few other questions have just jumped in. We could probably extend this conversation for an hour. I think that, you know, and I think that really speaks to like what, you know, what this moment is for us as journalists, what this moment is to us as Jews. You know, we had a thought that, oh, we'll cover the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and then we'll get back to our regular coverage. And I think this is kind of the note to end on, is that our regular coverage has shifted. It's clear that there's you know, there are long-term ramifications of what has been ignited in the last few weeks, that many people who are not thinking very much about Israeli policy at all within the Jewish world are feeling very concerned, worried, fearful, you know, questioning whether the people around them are thinking about them in the ways that they thought they had been thinking about them. And I think that that's a story that's very difficult to tell, but very important to tell. It's really knitted into the fabric of our society, and being able to understand what that looks like on the ground, and how long that lasts, and whether people and their relationships are changed for the long term. That really is our job and our role at JTA, and we're going to take that seriously. We want to hear your stories, the stories of people around you, certainly the folks around you who are experiencing the world differently from the way you are. If you can, you know, are part of these conversations on social media, and you're talking to somebody who's reading the newspaper, you may have very different experiences right now, and sharing those experiences and making them transparent, you know, something that we're really hoping to do and taking very seriously. I think we've reached the end of our time. We can end here. Thank you to Ben and Ron and Cnaan. Thank you to all of you for being here and your many thoughtful comments. We don't want to hear from you just in this moment. We're always happy to get notes to tips@jta.org, or you can reach out to any of us individually. We want to hear the questions you have, the stories you want to read, and the experiences that you're having in the world. Those are the stories we want to tell. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.